Welcome to our first Department of Medicine-wide Berson-Yalow Society conference. The Berson-Yalow Society is our physician scientist honor society, and this bench to bedside conference series really aims to bridge the gap between the sciences and clinical medicine. Today, I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Janice Nimura, acclaimed author of The Doctor's Blackwell, for which she received a Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her previous book, Daughters of the Samurai, A Journey from East to West and Back, was a New York Times notable book in 2015. Her essays and book reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Smithsonian, among many, many other prolific publications. While initially she thought she wanted to be a doctor herself, the humanities called to her and she pursued an English degree at Yale. She went on to work in publishing, moved to Japan with her Tokyo-born husband, and then returned to New York City to complete a master's in East Asian Studies at Columbia. She grew into an understanding that history is made of stories and fell in love with the archival treasure hunting, especially when it led to the forgotten lives of border-crossing 19th century women. We're happy to have her today for this inaugural lecture on the Blackwell sisters, the first women in America to receive their medical degrees. And it's fitting that we're doing this at the very beginning of Women's History Month. So without further ado, thank you so much, Janice.
Thank you so much for having me. And indeed, this is a very auspicious day. I'm so glad to be kicking off Women's History Month with all of you. I was just saying that having a medical audience for this book is an honor for me. I'm just going to share my screen, and there we go. All right, Blackwells. I'm assuming with a medical audience, most people have heard the name Elizabeth Blackwell, maybe. It's usually followed by the phrase in your mind, first woman doctor. She was the first woman in America to receive her medical diploma in 1849. Her sister Emily followed her to become the third woman doctor to receive an American medical degree in 1854. And together they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children, and then the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary. So I encountered the Blackwell story for the first time 5 years ago. This, despite the fact that I had grown up here in New York at a proudly feminist all-girls school from the age of 5. I was the math science kid at that school. I graduated, as you just heard, with the intention of pursuing medicine. I swerved. How was it possible that I had never heard of them? That didn't seem possible. So it made me curious. When I went in search of them, I discovered that, as Dr. Thomas was just saying, he read a children's book about Elizabeth Blackwell to his daughter. They are easiest to find on the children's biography shelf. This is a book from the 40s, a chapter book for young women. They have a lot in common, these children's books. They always feature a slim, elegant, well-dressed woman with a stethoscope bending over solicitously bending over a patient. We got this one from the 40s. This is the middle grade version from my daughter's school library, once upon a time. Here's the picture book version, slightly younger version of the elegant young woman, but there's the stethoscope waiting for her. The Blackwells looked like this. They were never photographed holding stethoscopes. Even if they had been in the 1840s and 50s, when they were as young and slim as the women in those picture books, stethoscopes mostly looked like this. So there was so much that was elided, that was sanitized, that was not present in those picture books. And as I moved further and further into the archives and started to read the words that Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell had written themselves in their own voices, it became very clear that they were not picture book heroines. They were complicated, self-contradictory, prickly, not always nice people. And I became really interested in the gap between the way they were in their own voices and the way they had become enshrined. And I became really curious about what was the whole story and not just what fit in a picture book. So what is that story? Briefly, the Blackwells, there were 9 siblings. 8 out of the 9 of them were born in Bristol, England. They came to America as children in 1832. They were the children of a man who was himself something of a paradox. He had made his money in the sugar refining industry. Bristol was a sugar capital. And in his free time, he was an ardent abolitionist. Think about that for a second. He had, profited from a commodity that depended on enslaved labor, but he was also a dreamer and wanted to find a way to make sugar, not out of cane in the Caribbean, but out of sugar beets in the North without enslaved labor. And on the strength of that dream, he moved his 8 then children and his wife and sisters all the way to America via New York, and then again, all the way out to the very edge of the known world in 1838, which turned out to be Cincinnati. Hoping to find a way to grow sugar beets. And having gotten all the way out to Cincinnati, before really even having finished unpacking, he died, leaving his wife and now 9 children with $20, and leaving his 5 daughters with the clear lesson that a husband is no guarantee of security. None of the 5 Blackwell sisters ever married. So 9 Blackwell siblings, stranded on the edge of civilization, orphaned. They really became a tribe at this point, and that was a great gift to the biographer of the future, because they were rarely all in the same place at the same time, and they constantly were writing to each other. So just to give you a taste of what it feels like to do this kind of archival research, in the mid-Victorian era, when paper and postage were both quite steep, this is what you did. You filled the page, and then you rotated it 90 degrees and filled it again. This is what it looks close up. This is a letter from Elizabeth Blackwell's brother, Henry, who had the best handwriting in the family. So this is what you need to decipher if you're into 19th century archival research. I happen to love this stuff, but some people find it scary. But this was a great gift. They were constantly writing to each other and about each other. So as far as being able to weave a fuller story together from many perspectives, I was in good shape. Elizabeth was born in 1821. She just had her 200th birthday on February 3rd. She was voraciously brilliant, socially quite awkward, blessed with a healthy ego. She admired the transcendentalist writer Margaret Fuller, who at that moment in the mid-1840s had published a bestseller called Woman in the 19th Century. And this was a book that would have been in the Blackwell parlor. Elizabeth would have read it. And this idea of Margaret Fuller's resonated with her, this idea that humanity was not going to reach the next level of enlightenment until its women claimed their own independence and proved that they could do anything they wanted to do and be anything they wanted to be by virtue of effort and talent. It had nothing to do with sex. They could be sea captains if they wanted to. And until that was proven, humanity was going to be stuck. This really resonated with Elizabeth. As I said, she had a healthy self-esteem. She saw herself as someone whose life could be important, whose life could be a beacon to other women and could prove Margaret Fuller's point, lead people toward the light. So she chose medicine, not because she loved science, not because she was called to heal. She didn't particularly like people. She liked humanity, but she wasn't crazy about individuals. She thought sickness was a form of weakness. She thought bodily functions were disgusting. But medicine was an unusually clear way to prove her point. She would have rather done history or philosophy, but that wasn't going to make the point she wanted to make. Medicine in this moment, in the mid-1840s, is redefining itself, both scientifically and institutionally. To this point, it has looked a lot like it did in antiquity, humoral medicine, heroic medicine, and increasing and considered mostly a trade of midwives, of barber surgeons. Now, increasingly, it was a profession of men who were starting to push women to the side, and a profession of men credentialed by virtue of having gone to a medical school and received a diploma. That was how you defined yourself as a doctor nowadays. So Elizabeth thought, if a woman can find her way into one of those medical schools and attend all the lectures and pass all the examinations, who can say she is not as qualified as any man to be a doctor? It was a very elegant sort of theoretical proof. Also, as this cartoon from 1825 suggests, medical school at that moment was not the culminating academic challenge that it is today. Some of you know, I have a daughter who's pre-med. I know exactly what she's up against. This was not what one was up against in the 1840s. Medicine was sort of what you gravitated toward if you weren't smart enough for the law. Medical school consisted of 2 consecutive, identical 16-week terms repeated one year after the next, Purely lectures. If you went to a particularly well-equipped medical school, you might get to dissect, but sometimes you didn't. You emerged from these 2 terms of medical school with a diploma and alarmingly little practical experience. Whatever you might have gleaned in between terms, following a doctor around maybe. Elizabeth, who knew something of her own brilliance, was fairly confident that if she could make it to a medical school, she was not going to have any trouble once she got there. So at the age of 26, after a sheaf of rejections, she finally received a letter of acceptance from Geneva Medical College in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes, not far from Seneca Falls, interestingly, but we'll get there. On the left, that is the medical building as it once looked. It doesn't stand, but it is now this spot. The photo on the right is where it once stood. This campus has evolved into Hobart and William Smith colleges, a lovely place to visit and a very historic row here, which looks very much like it would have looked when Elizabeth Blackwell was there. So if you read her memoir, which was written 50 years later, you get a basic, finally a letter of acceptance arrived and I set out triumphantly for Geneva, New York. The reality was a little bit more farcical. What really happened was that Elizabeth had been studying with a sympathetic and rather socially prominent doctor in Philadelphia, who had written a letter of support for her strange quest. It was absolutely outrageous, the idea that a woman would go to medical school and study the functions of the body in the company of men. That was just appalling on every level. But this man was sympathetic. He was, I think, a Quaker and a free thinker, a progressive. And he sent this letter along. And the faculty of Geneva College were not quite brave enough to just reject the recommendation of this man in Philadelphia. Geneva was the provinces. It was a tiny rural school. These were not the most powerful medical professionals around. They balked at rejecting it out of hand. So they punted. They sent the question to their students and they said, okay, guys, this woman wants to come join your class. If any one of you objects, we'll tell her no. But it's up to you. They thought they would be safe. Surely one of these students would say, no, that's appalling. We can't have that. But the students, a raucous and rather boisterous provincial bunch, were smart enough to recognize that the professors were being cowards and that this was a serious opportunity to make mischief. Probably a prank cooked up by a rival medical school, they said to each other. And of course, sure, bring her on. Let's unanimously say yes to this woman. And then they forgot about it. They thought that was funny. Haha. And then 3 weeks later, in she walked to the lecture hall. Once admitted, she quickly learned that even though medical practice hadn't been her vocation, it was definitely enough of an intellectual challenge to stimulate her and satisfy her. And she sort of warmed to the subject. And she left the students in her dust. They quickly came to respect her, knowing that if they studied alongside her, they would probably do better. The community of Geneva Medical College quickly realized that she was quite brilliant and was not going to embarrass them. The townspeople of Geneva were a little slower. They tended to think she was either wicked or insane. What kind of woman would do this? Anyway, she's on her way. In between her 2 terms, she returns to Philadelphia and lives at Blockley Almshouse, which at the time is the largest municipal hospital in America. As David Oshinsky at NYU called it, a warehouse, or called Bellevue, very similarly, a warehouse for the destitute. This was the kind of place where you ended up if you had no other options. It was a great place to witness illness. It was not a great place to witness healing. Elizabeth found herself living in a room off the female syphilis ward. And from having no practical experience with patients, she suddenly had more than she could handle. People who ended up in the hospital with tertiary syphilis and the effects of the mercury that had probably been used to treat it were in really bad shape. Since this is a lunchtime lecture, I just thought I would spare you the slide I have of necrotic lesions on the skull caused by syphilis, including the characteristic collapsed profile called saddle nose that was a sure sign of late-stage syphilis. You can leave that to the imagination. So this is her first exposure to the idea, the connection between poverty and health, the question of that connection, and her first also exposure to graphic epidemic disease. This is 1848. There are waves of refugees arriving from Ireland with bringing typhus with them, which was then called ship fever. Elizabeth decides to write her thesis for Geneva College on ship fever. I was intrigued by the fact that she sort of pointedly did not choose anything that was gynecological. She chose a really gender neutral thing to study. And this experience clearly started to orient her toward questions of public health and what that meant. This was an idea that was just emerging, and she connected to it partly from this experience. She graduated at the top of her class. Her ship fever thesis was published as the lead article in the Buffalo Medical Journal. I mean, there was no question that she was a particularly brilliant student, whatever her gender. And then she needed some practical training. And so, like many American medical students who had a diploma but no experience, she went to Europe because the centers of medical education there were burning a little bit more brightly than America at that point. And a lot of American young men, medical graduates, would go there to kind of burnish their reputations. So Elizabeth went to Paris, to a public maternity hospital called La Maternité. Paris was a very progressive center of medical education. It was a lot of state-sponsored medical education. La Maternité was a place to which young women, untrained young women from all over France came to train as midwives, trained by the state to then go back to their provinces and work as midwives. Elizabeth already had an MD, but she made the interesting choice to commit to being a student again in this hospital because of the volume of obstetric cases she would be exposed to there. So this convent still stands in Paris. Got to climb around in there and explore, took this picture.
I think your sound may have cut off. I don't know if it's just me.
Hey, Janice?
Although not its direction. I'm sorry, my computer is sending me all sorts of strange messages. Can you hear me okay? Can somebody just nod? Yes.
We just lost you for a few minutes, actually.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. Okay, where did I? La Maternité, treating women who were, by definition, if they were delivering in a hospital, they were not wealthy women. And many of them were infected with venereal disease. So here Elizabeth undergoes a medical catastrophe that changes the shape of her career a bit. She is treating an infant that has been born to a woman infected with gonorrhea. The infant has contracted gonococcal conjunctivitis, and Elizabeth is syringing its eyes when some of the washing liquid splashes into her own face. And she contracts gonococcal conjunctivitis, which today, while not a joke, would be very treatable, then was absolutely a catastrophe. So she is confined to a bed within the hospital where she's been working. And she eventually loses one eye. This is an astonishing thing to think about when you think about what she's up against. It's also a good moment to pause and give you a sense of what it's like to be the person trying to tell the story when there are multiple sources to work with. So Elizabeth had a colleague at La Maternité, an attending physician, the wonderfully named Hippolyte Blue, who was she had become quite friendly with. He immediately took charge of her care and tried to save her sight. I mean, the question of her having sight was in the balance. This is how she wrote about it in her memoir years later. Ah, how dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished and the eye was left in darkness. It's sort of like a romance novel. And he clearly has leading man qualities from this photo. Coincidentally, at the same time in Paris, Elizabeth's eldest sister, Anna Blackwell, happened to be in town, which was lucky because she could help take care of her afflicted sister. Anna Blackwell, the eldest, was, as this pose wonderfully suggests, a Class A drama queen, a hypochondriac, and a journalist. So she spent the days tending to her by her sister's bedside, and the evenings writing copious letters home to the Blackwell clan, reporting on what was happening to Elizabeth. She says things like, "The pupil presents just now the appearance of one of those little misshapen blackberries of 3 granulations and half dried up that one sees so often on some scrubby little bush. If you can fancy one such in dull-looking lead, you have just the appearance of this poor eye." So you get a sense of how to braid these into something that approximates what was really happening. Elizabeth lost one eye, was fitted for a glass eye eventually, managed to recover, did not go back to Cincinnati to convalesce, as I think most of the rest of us would consider doing. She continued on. This is a portrait taken just after that. If you look at it carefully, you can see that there's an asymmetry in her gaze, but it's hard to tell. There were many people in the rest of her life who never realized that she had any disability at all. She never spoke of it. But onward she went to London to work at St. Bartholomew's for more practical training, and their mutual friends introduced her to Florence Nightingale. This was 1850-51. Florence Nightingale is not yet the global celebrity, the lady with the lamp from the Crimean War, which hasn't happened yet. She is a young woman of wealthy family, frustrated at home with parents who are beseeching her to settle down and get married, whereas she has big dreams of nursing, of hygiene, sanitary ideas, helping the poor. And here comes Elizabeth Blackwell, who bursts into her life like a comet and proves to her something about what a woman can be. Here's Elizabeth Blackwell, right? Proving Margaret Fuller's idea. To Florence Nightingale, here's this woman who has left her family behind, is not talking about marriage, has a medical degree, is gallivanting all over Europe despite illness and all sorts of challenges, getting medical experience. Elizabeth Blackwell is proof to Florence Nightingale that what she is imagining is possible. I like to think of Elizabeth Blackwell as a catalyst on Florence Nightingale. So they have this sort of ecstatic initial friendship where they spend a lot of time together in London. But they quickly discover that there's this basic divide between the way they think. Florence Nightingale really believes that the place of women, the mission of women in health, is as nurses, teaching hygiene, promoting that. And Elizabeth Blackwell refuses to let go of the idea that her job as a woman in medicine is to prove that women can be doctors. And so they never quite converge throughout life. They keep corresponding. They are always sort of moving on the edge of each other's orbits, but they never quite align, which is an interesting story in itself. Elizabeth at this point is done in Europe. She decides, I'm going to go back to New York and set up my practice there. And it'll probably be wonderfully successful because there will probably be all these women who want to confide the details of their gynecological ailments to a female physician, right? Wrong. She gets to New York and tries to set up a practice and no one comes. Largely because the very phrase female physician in the 1850s means someone like this woman, Madame Restel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist, caricatured here in the National Police Gazette as a baby-eating demon. This is what most people thought of when the phrase female physician came up. It wasn't bright young woman with a medical degree. And so no one came. And suddenly she had no source of income, which was serious. What to do next? Well, meanwhile, while she's stalled, she is watching her sister, Emily. Emily is 5 years younger and has been anointed by Elizabeth to follow her into medicine. Elizabeth, realizing that being a woman in medicine was going to be a steep and lonely path, basically commands Emily to follow her. She likes the Blackwells more than anybody else in the world and has more respect for them. And Emily happens to be the most brilliant of her 4 sisters. So she picks Emily. She's also younger and I think more commandable. Emily looks at her prospects and frankly has a lot more interest in science than Elizabeth ever did and says, okay, sure, I'll do this. She has at least as much trouble getting a spot in medical school as Elizabeth did, partly because Elizabeth's success has spooked all of the medical schools into barring their doors even more firmly against women. And also, meanwhile, because there are more and more women who are interested in studying medicine, there are beginning to be women's medical colleges too, one in Philadelphia and one in Boston, and others coming. And so men's medical colleges have even more ability to say no, because there's a place for women to go. Why do you need to come here? There's a women's medical college, go there. Emily, being proud and a Blackwell, was not going to settle for a degree any less prestigious and impressive than the one Elizabeth had won. So she finally found her way to Rush in Chicago, where she spent a wonderful year of initial study with a good mentor who respected her, and then left on sabbatical, at which point the trustees of Rush said, actually, could you not come back at all, ever? And she was forced to scramble and find somewhere else to finish her degree. That would turned out to be Cleveland Medical College, which has evolved into Case Western. She did finally get her diploma there in 1854, and then she too headed off to Europe. She went to Edinburgh, and she sort of attached herself to the practice of James Young Simpson. Quite a choice. He was one of the most prominent physicians in Britain at the time. He was physician to the Queen. He was a professor at the University of Edinburgh. He was the man who had discovered the anesthetic properties of chloroform. He discovered them, the story goes, by passing a decanter of chloroform around at his dinner table, upon which all of his friends took a whiff, burst into hysterical laughter, and passed out under the table. They have the decanter preserved in a museum, so there has to be some truth to that story. Anyway, a flamboyant man who I think kind of enjoyed the shock value of having a woman among his assistants, although he respected her quite a lot and taught her a great deal. He was a gynecologist and an obstetrician to the wealthy, and a pioneer of things like the pelvic exam. He taught Emily the uses of pessaries. A stem pessary would have been used in cases of uterine prolapse, all too common in women having too many pregnancies. Invented the instrument below, Simpson's uterine sound, for measuring the dimensions of the cervix. Emily, meanwhile, is writing all of this home to Elizabeth. You can see her diagrams of the instruments on the left side of this letter. Elizabeth languishing in New York, rationing her firewood, not enough quite to eat. Emily learning at the cutting edge of medical technique and writing everything home. This is another moment where I can pause and sort of show how much fun it is to do this kind of work. From the beginning, I wanted this book not to just be about Elizabeth Blackwell, but to be a story of sisters, because I really believed that Elizabeth's legacy would not have been the same without Emily as her partner and support. But of course, there's not as much information about Emily as there is about Elizabeth. So what do you do when you don't have as much material to work from, but you want to have a double portrait? One of the things you can do is follow your subjects around and see what you can glean from the world that they moved in. So I went to Edinburgh. Poor me, had to have an excuse to go. And I went to Queen Street, where Simpson's house still stands, the tallest in the row, the only one with an extra story, because his family and his practice and his friends were bursting at the seams. The day I walked by and took this picture, the door was open. So in the spirit of following in the footsteps, I walked in. It is now a drug rehabilitation center, so I wasn't exactly trespassing on private property. But just even walking in and wandering around a bit until they told me I should wander out again, you pick up details about what Emily's life would have been every day, walking from the old town to the new, across the mound, and up this staircase in James Young Simpson's house, into which his initials had been worked. I mean, they're still there. And that teaches you something, both about what it felt like to be Emily and what kind of guy puts his initials in his banister. A flamboyant man. I also got to go to the Royal College of Surgeons Museum, which I highly are interested in history of medicine and pathology. They wouldn't let me take photos, but here's my notebook. On the left, Simpson's pocket pill case in the middle there, with "Please return to 52 Queen Street" under the lid, his monaural stethoscopes in ivory and rosewood there on the lower left. They even had, as I said, the decanter with the chloroform in it. Good stuff. So Emily is training there, learning a huge amount, really becoming a more proficient physician and starting to feel her own power as a physician. And Elizabeth also has had some really extraordinary training in Europe, both of them really at this point performing at the top of their game. Not enough, though, to prevent the rest of the world from looking at them askance. This is a cartoon from the London satiric newspaper Punch, depicting Emily on the right in the scandalous bloomer costume of the women's rights activist, and a ridiculous hat and a rather mannish profile, peering through spectacles at the only patient who would consult her, a lapdog, being clutched by a more conventionally feminine young woman. The accompanying article said something like, yeah, female physicians are all right. I guess they'll be good at taking care of their husbands and children. That's about all that you can expect of them. Anyway, Elizabeth and Emily both were very good at ignoring this kind of snark. So Emily then is done, and she returns finally to join Elizabeth in New York, where together in 1857, they found the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children in a building that still stands on the corner of Bleecker and Crosby Streets in the Village, as it was on the left and as it sort of is now, although it has just been undergoing an extraordinary restoration. I got a chance to befriend the woman who owns this building, who is restoring it, and to get inside and see some of the original space, the hearths, the beams, the huge sash windows. This was the place where they founded a hospital, which was the first to be staffed by women. The idea was not just to create a place for the women of the tenements to be able to consult female doctors, but also to provide a place for the slowly growing numbers of female medical graduates to have a place to train. Hospitals were not interested in having women walking the wards, really. This was a place where finally some of that practical experience was available. As you might expect, the Blackwells were active when the Civil War broke out. As soon as it did, they called a meeting in their own parlor of the people who had supported the opening of the infirmary, their donors and supporters, and drafted a little snippet to go into the New York Times the next day to the women of New York, and especially to those already engaged in preparing against the time of wounds and sickness in the army. They were interested in organizing the sort of chaotic energy that was focused at the Union cause, and kind of channeling it. In response to this appeal, thousands of women converged on Cooper Union, another building that still stands, to form what would eventually be called the Women's Central Association of Relief, out of which also grew the US Sanitary Commission. So you can sort of draw a straight line from the Blackwell's living room to the US Sanitary Commission. The Blackwell sisters were placed at the head of the committee that was charged with selecting and training young women to be nurses at the front. And they dove into that work, which felt to them initially like exactly what they had been working toward, this idea of women working alongside men in a medical capacity to raise humanity to a new level. They were quickly disillusioned because it became clear that the male physicians of New York were not really interested in working alongside the Blackwell sisters as colleagues. It's fine if they stayed in their own hospital, but now when they were trying to coordinate efforts to train nurses, suddenly the Blackwells found themselves shunted aside too often. The leading leadership role in Washington went to Dorothea Dix, who was not a medical professional in any way. Elizabeth called her the meddler in chief. They felt snubbed and eventually withdrew their support after a year of effort, and focused instead of on the war on their next project, which was sort of an ironic project, the founding of their own women's medical college. Elizabeth and Emily had never wanted to found a women's medical college. They didn't believe that medical education should be segregated by sex. But as long as women's medical colleges existed, the men were not going to let the women into their classes. And as far as Elizabeth and Emily were concerned, the existing women's medical colleges were turning out an inferior product. The young women who were arriving at the infirmary for graduate training weren't particularly well trained. So they changed their minds and said, okay, we will open a women's medical college for now that is more rigorous and more challenging and more excellent than the programs we ourselves experience. It'll be longer, it'll be progressive. The courses will not repeat, they will build on each other. There will be practical training. And so that's what they did. They opened their own medical college in 1868, 1869 with a degree of excellence beyond what they had experienced. So that's the arc of their professional lives. Personally, their lives are just as fascinating. Both sisters adopted daughters. Emily lived with her partner and fellow surgeon Elizabeth Cushier for the last several decades of her life. Two of their brothers, Henry and Sam, married two of the most prominent feminists of the day, Lucy Stone, the women's suffrage activist, and Antoinette Brown, who was the first woman in America to be ordained as a minister. To complicate the story further, Elizabeth and Emily didn't really see eye to eye with these sisters-in-law of theirs. They were out of step with the women's movement, even when it joined their own family. The women's movement had made its clear first priority the vote, and Elizabeth especially did not really endorse that as the top priority for women. She felt that if you give women the vote when they are still in thrall to their fathers and husbands and brothers, they'll just vote the way they're told. What use is a vote if the mind has not been liberated yet? So they were out of step there. In addition, Elizabeth and Emily disagreed with each other to a certain extent. Elizabeth moving more and more toward public health and public policy, the idea of a woman doctor as a teacher armed with science. Emily, on the other hand, was an excellent surgeon, obstetrician, gynecologist, medical professor. Her idea of a woman in medicine was to be as good at all of those things as any man. So once the Women's Medical College was founded, and with some relief, they parted ways and spent the last 40 years of their lives on different continents. Elizabeth went back to England, where she had always wanted to be, having come to America at 11, had never quite identified with being American. So she returned there and did a lot more in the sphere of public policy and public health than in actual practice, leaving Emily in New York to lead the institutions they had founded very competently, and in many ways, I think, sustain her sister's legacy to her own detriment, because if you've heard of Blackwell at all, you often haven't heard of Emily. So that's the outline of the story, and this feels like a good moment for this story, not just because all we do is think about public health these days, but it's also a good moment for a story of complicated female leaders. We've just finally elected one to the White House almost. I like to end with this photo because for me, it's a thought piece about female leaders and how we see them. If you Google Elizabeth Blackwell and go to images, this image comes up every time. It is a photo in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York, and it comes up on websites, in articles, it's in documentary films, it's on the cover of at least one biography. This is not a picture of Elizabeth Blackwell. How do we know? Well, if you flip it over, it has the studio on the back, and the studio is Dana's Photo Portrait Gallery on 14th Street and 6th Avenue. It wasn't there until 1885. In 1885, Elizabeth Blackwell was in her 60s. She didn't look like this. So why does this misidentification persist? It persists because this is more about what we want our heroines to look like. You know, we want our heroines to be attractive and perky and elegant and strong, but not too strong. We want them to be likable. We want them to be adorable. We want to adore them. Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell were not adorable. And that is sort of what drew me to them, because I think it's really an important lesson for all of us, especially right now, to learn how to hold those things alongside each other. Somebody who has done something extraordinary and isn't always admirable. It's an important, hard thing to be able to do. And I think it's really important that we figure out how to do it, because these are the kinds of people who change the world. So I'm going to unshare my screen. Thank you for listening, and I'd be really happy to take questions. Let's see. If people want to put questions in the chat or raise their hands.
Thank you for that. I guess I'll start. So I think, I mean, it's such an interesting story, I think. And I guess from my perspective, not just because I'm called Emily, but also because I also like research, but I've always been interested. I think maybe I read somewhere that Emily Blackwell had set up did she have like a lab in her attic or something? Is that true?
Gosh, I'd like to know where you read that.
I don't know where I came across that. Or it's part of the thing. I think she did a lot more research, right?
She was somebody who was interested in technique. She was interested in how to do things better. You know, when confronted with a surgical problem, she was curious about how to refine it so that it worked better in a very scientific way that Elizabeth never gravitated toward. Well, Emily was really the scientist and the surgeon.
Yeah, I think my other fascination with them has just been how they're not as nice as we like to think they are, and how I think you mentioned previously about how they were quite tough on their trainees.
Tough on their trainees and tough on women in general. I mean, I think it's another lesson that I think is very resonant with this moment is their own misogyny. I mean, these were people who had committed their lives to proving something about what women could do, and at the same time had an extraordinarily dim view of women in general. That, you know, I say Elizabeth was the first woman to get a medical degree and Emily was the third. Well, who was the second? The second was a woman named Nancy Talbot Clark, who actually got her degree at Case Western at Cleveland Medical College just before Emily, having achieved basically what Emily had achieved. But Elizabeth and Emily always referred to her as Little Mrs. Clark, and not in a particularly nice way. And they kept their distance from her. And at the one and the same time, I found that profoundly disappointing and profoundly understandable, because if you have clawed your way to the place where they had gotten, the last thing you wanted was to be undermined by someone who looked sort of like you categorically, but wasn't as good. Elizabeth and Emily were of that early wave, that very early wave of feminists whose style of feminism was not radical activism, it was excellence. If we are undeniably excellent, the world will come to meet us. So just don't make waves, don't make noise, don't be appalling, just be as good as you can possibly be, and no one will be able to deny you. That was sort of their credo. And that makes it very hard to collaborate with other people, I think. So.
Hi, Janice. Thank you so much. It was amazing to hear the story again, and I really loved the book. But I guess what I also found really interesting was just the historical aspect of hearing about the medical techniques that were underway during that time period and kind of the evolution. And also, I think that they actually held a lot of the common ideology from that time period, such as like the connection between what was presumed disease and morality, which I found surprising, because I think the way I grew up learning about the Blackwell sisters was that they were these really strong women who forged a path. And I do think that it is that little bit of a tension that they held a lot of the same common beliefs as many of their male colleagues. And I think I really liked the point of the book that it's important to acknowledge the tension because it can feel uncomfortable, because we want our women heroines to be very strong. But I think that was some of the most fascinating parts for me.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt in my mind that they were strong. They had to, though, walk this very delicate line, because if you're trying to break into an establishment, you don't want to give the establishment any ammunition to say that you're a quack. So even though things were changing, germ theory was coming in, the idea that mercury was a good idea was going out. But if the old guard was still really holding on to that hard, and you needed their respect in order to have any credibility at all, what do? It's part of why they founded their own institution. Elizabeth would talk about wanting to be able to commit heresy with intelligence. If you're in someone else's institution, you have to play by their rules. And she wanted to be able to do things like use cold water and fresh air more than calomel and laudanum if she could. At the same time, as you say, she came to medicine at a moment where, like, it was sort of like, you know, how a chick imprints on a goose or something. She came to it at this moment where the idea was that good behavior was conducive to health. that if you lived a moral life, you wouldn't get venereal disease. And that stuck in her mind. So the idea when germ theory sort of burst on the scene, that an amoral microbe could be responsible for gonorrhea didn't compute for her. That undermined a lot of the sort of the moral impact of the lessons she had learned, and she wasn't ready to accept that. So and again, Emily had an easier time because she was more of a scientist. She was more of an empiricist, of an observer. So all of those tensions are there, and they're very human. At the same time, Elizabeth was very open-minded about certain things. She wasn't ready to dismiss new fads out of hand. She was very careful to kind of take them in and find out for herself whether there was anything in them, whether it was the water cure or magnetism or anything that we think of as quackery. She wasn't sure yet, so she was going to find out. I read about all the leeches and the lancets and all of the blisters and all of the horror of medical treatment just before the Blackwells, and I wonder sometimes, like, if we could fast forward 150 years from now, what will we think of? What then will people think is barbaric that we do now, as a matter of course, and think of as cutting edge? It's all a continuum.
Bilateral chest tube?
What did the other sisters do other than Emily and Elizabeth?
Right. So Anna was a journalist. She was a journalist and a translator. She spent most of her life in Europe. She was the first one to go back, and she never came back to America. She was very dismayed that her family settled there for real. But she translated from the French and reported back from Paris to America a lot. Elizabeth, Emily. Marion was the second oldest. She was the one who never had a profession. She was sort of like the domestic center of the family and took care of the mom and kind of held the center. And then there was little sister Ellen, who became a painter and studied in Europe with Ruskin. But Elizabeth and Emily were the most professionally successful. Then two of their brothers, Henry and Sam, became kind of the first feminist husbands and really supported their wives' careers. And then there were two more brothers. One died young and the other one made a fortune in real estate, and I think went a long way toward financing a lot of what Elizabeth and Emily were able to do.
I'm curious about your process, if you don't mind talking a little bit about it, kind of like exploring all the papers that you had to find and kind of to gather the information that you were able to gather. I think that's just fascinating to me. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, you'll hear biographers say that if you don't feel like you're drowning in sources, then you probably don't have enough. And that's true. It's also terrifying. There were something like 100,000+ pieces of material at Radcliffe in the Schlesinger Library for Women's History. There was another 30,000 or so pieces at the Library of Congress. There's another dump at Columbia. There's stuff at various hospitals. And then there was little bits of peripheral stuff in London and Bristol and Edinburgh and Geneva, New York, and all those places. Yeah, it took me a while to commit to this project because it was so vast and because it intersected so much with very well-known stories. I mean, she meets Lincoln, she meets Lady Byron, Florence Nightingale. These are much biographied people. I didn't feel like I had a whole lot more to add about them, and that was scary. But mostly the other piece of advice that's my credo is good historical writing is all about leaving out the boring stuff. Dirty little secret, don't love reading biography because I love reading fiction. I love reading story. It was a revelation to me. I hated studying history as a student because history seemed very boring to me. I had a revelation in college when I finally stumbled upon a professor who was an incredible storyteller. And oh my gosh, history is just stories about people. So when I read through all those thousands and thousands and thousands of letters, I'm reading for the story. I'm reading not just for what happened, but also for the little sort of juicy, sparkly bits. I feel like sort of like a magpie, collect all the sparkly bits and then sort of try to string them all together. And amazingly, that often is enough. to tell a good story. I mean, I try to write what I like to read, which is something that moves. I'm not interested in an academic treatment where every detail, every fact that is available is contained in this book. That is not what you're going to find in this book. But if the story sparks your interest and you become someone who wants to know more, you can go and find more. All the footnotes are there. You can go and look it all up. But I try to write for people who don't think they like to read this stuff, i.e. myself, and make it documented enough that if people want to pursue it more deeply, it's all there laid out.
Thank you. I'm listening to you kind of talk about your process. It almost sounds like how I think through, like, or we think through patient cases. You kind of want to pick and choose the parts that really matter and synthesize it in a way that someone wants to read and someone wants to use to understand. So I can see why you were interested in becoming a doctor at first.
Well, it's interesting because medicine was really the path not taken for me. And if you look up on my website, I wrote an essay over the winter about the ecstatic day I got to spend at Bellevue following my friend who's an obstetrician there around watching babies being born as part of the research. I promised myself I would do that. But I feel like this book has sort of let me slip in the back door of narrative medicine. And I love narrative medicine. And I'm always have felt a bit like a poser because I don't have a medical degree. But yeah, that kind of finding the story and letting the story lead. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this wonderful podcast called The Nocturnists, which is sort of like the Moth story hour for healthcare people. Emily Silverman is a physician in San Francisco who has created this podcast. And that's really what she's talking about is that you learn, even as even as somebody who is studying medicine, you learn more deeply if you know the story behind a scientific discovery, that kind of thing. So I slipped in the back door and I'm hoping that nobody kicks me out.
I think one more question is just, when do you think they evolved from like their real selves into these kind of fairy tale characters that they've become in books now?
I think that happens because the story is, you want to be able to say, look, honey, here's the first woman doctor. Maybe you can be a doctor someday. But the story is too prickly and complicated. And so it needs to be sanded down if a kid is going to be able to consume it. I think that happens across the board with all children's biographies. I think what didn't happen here is that there aren't that many adult biographies. Usually somebody comes along and then tells the whole story, but I think the Blackwells didn't appeal, I think, to the grown-up biographers because they didn't conform to the triumphant feminist narrative. And too much of what they did and said was out of step with that. If you are coming at it from a feminist perspective, and I'm certainly a feminist, it can be disappointing when your subject doesn't say the things that you believe. I think that's part of what makes it interesting. But I think, I don't think it was unusual that they got kind of children's bookized. What was unusual was that no one gave them a full treatment, 100 years later, the way we have a million biographies of Lincoln or Florence Nightingale. I mean, my own editor at my publisher was, at different times was sort of like, I don't like these women very much. And I would say, yes, that's right. That's exactly right. That's the point. they're not always likable. That's what we have to push through. So.
I want to thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I was going to say that my only experience was, I think there's a book in just the relationship between Elizabeth Blackwell and Florence Nightingale.
Certainly a novel.
I think it would be a perfect historical novel because the correspondence was incredible, from best friends to literally maybe what could be called petty jealousy.
Oh, more than petty.
Yeah, I mean, just craziness. And then I remember reading an article, I don't remember the journal, when they talked about the relationship and how I think the last physician, you might correct me if I'm wrong, the last physician to take care of Florence Nightingale when she was on her deathbed was a woman.
Oh, really?
Which I think was the most incredible kind of circle, which was that, that at the very end, she supported that. So
There's your final scene.
it was the final scene. I just
you
think
go.
that correspondence was just so incredible. So thank you so much for this. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks again for joining. Thanks again for giving such an amazing talk about a very interesting and relevant topic. And thanks to everyone who was able to join and participate.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.